So we're continuing the series we've been in parables from Tae Kwon Do, and today my guess is that you are looking at another term in your bulletin and have no idea what it is. So just to kind of bring us all up to speed, if you remember, what we've been doing is taking some of these ideas, terminology from a different tradition, a different culture, and using them as illustrations to kind of get our brains in a groove to hopefully take our Christian understanding and give it more depth, a little more clarity, and a little more practicality. If nothing else, you've at least learned 4 or 5 new terms in Korean that you probably didn't know before we started this series. Today I want to give you 2 things that we're going to focus in on. We're going to focus in on Trinity, both capital T and lowercase t, and we're also going to focus in on convergence. So let those be kind of front and foremost of your mind as we go through this. The term there is called Sahm Taeguk, okay? And it is based in something that I think most of you are familiar with. TJ, could you throw that up? So what we're looking at here is the Pepsi symbol. I can't take credit for that. When I said, what's that look like? Rob Rafesigner from the first service said, it looks like Pepsi. So we have a circle divided in half with a winding line with the top half red, the bottom half blue on a field of white. Okay? This is kind of the central part of the South Korean flag. The Korean flag is actually called the Taeguk-gi. And this symbol is just called a Taeguk. Now, is anybody familiar with this symbol from another term? The yin-yang, right? So we're going to lay some foundation with this whole idea of yin-yang. In Korean they call it umyang, because it's going to lead us to a more simplified understanding of the Sahm Taeguk, which we're going to get to, and then that's going to really drive us into this sense of Trinitarian thought. But this yin-yang is about opposites, contrasts, right? It's about that everything has its counter. There's 2 sides to every coin, and both sides are necessary if we are going to live in fullness and understanding and in balance. And they play off of each other in a way that is essential. So a very simple shorthand of it would be if we take the concept of joy, and what would its opposite be? Sorrow, right? Joy without sorrow doesn't have as much meaning or as much it's not as significant. Because if all I feel is joy, I have nothing to bounce it off of. That's just normal. So there's less appreciation for it. And likewise with sorrow, if there's no sense of joy, sorrow doesn't have as much meaning. It's just normal. And so the 2 play off of each other in a way that gives us a greater depth to our life and a greater depth of understanding about the nature of life. I'm sure we would all rather have no sorrow, but we're going to see in a second where even spiritually, the presence of sorrow can actually be a deep gift. With joy and sorrow, just this simple illustration, the sorrow helps us appreciate and embrace the joy more fully. Now, the sorrow, what joy does for that really depends on our outlook. Because the sorrow, joy can do one of 2 things. It can either make the sorrow more acute because we realize we're not in a state of joy and we wish we were, or having that contrast of joy can give us hope in the midst of sorrow because we know that there is something bigger and better beyond it. Now, spiritually, this also is significant. Because let me ask you this. Is your experience of God through your joy the same as your experience of God through your sorrow? They're not. When we're experiencing joy, we may experience appreciation and gratitude. We may look at what has made us joyful and ask the question of, Lord, with this blessing that I've been given, what am I supposed to do with it to honor you? So maybe it gives us a little more purpose or a little more intention about God's call. In sorrow, we tend to go to God for strength and for assurance, for hope, for compassion, for mercy. And these are both essential experiences of faith, but they are tied to 2 very different experiences in our lives. But the two gives us a much more complete understanding of God than only one. Now, this is a great start to looking at life and faith. But there's a trap that a lot of times we fall into. Because we look at that and we see the red and the blue. But those are compartments, right? And we have a tendency to compartmentalize things in our lives. And just like this Umyang symbol, compartmentalizing is both a good thing and a bad thing. Compartmentalizing is what helps us draw healthy boundaries with our relationships. Compartmentalizing can help us to focus on a task that requires great concentration. Even if there's other parts of our life that are problematic or troubling, we're able to compartmentalize what we have to do so we can do justice to it and not allow other things to creep in on it. Compartmentalizing can be a very, very healthy thing. And yet at the same time, if everything is compartmentalized, it can be very damaging, particularly when we talk about our faith. Have you ever looked back on your life, and I'm saying looking in the mirror, okay? I'm going to encourage this both ways because sometimes we see it in ourselves, more often we see it in other people, where there's an individual who professes a deep and abiding faith in Jesus. They go to church, they know all the right lingo and all the right language, and then outside of church, you look at their attitudes and the way that they act, and the attitudes and actions are completely opposite what Christ would call them to do. And what do we usually ask ourselves at that point? How can that be? Right? Now, there's a lot of different explanations, but one of them is compartmentalizing. I've got my Christian self here. I've got my work self here. I've got my hobby self here. I've got my friend self here. And if I'm a real nasty, deceitful jerk to people at work, and you ask me how I can do that, then I'm just going to say, well, you should see me in church. I do go to church every Sunday. And if you were to see me in church, you would see who I really am. But is that how God calls our faith to interact with our lives? No. In terms of our faith, there should be no compartmentalizing. It is something that should speak into every facet of who we are. When we think about things like family, family is something that should bleed through the different areas of our life because that's something that's highly significant and deserves consideration no matter where we are, no matter what we're doing. And so this idea of compartmentalization is both and. But if all we focus on is the compartments, we miss the practical. Because a part that people typically don't look at in the image is the line that is between the halves. Because with this symbol, the line is the practice of saying, find the middle path. Find the harmony. Find the balance between. Because that's where you're going to find peace. That's where you're going to find balance. That's where you're going to find truth. So this is the Taeguk, or the Umyang. The next one is the Sahm Taeguk, which is similar but different. In Korean, the word Sahm means third. This is a Taeguk with a third compartment. But when you have three compartments, what can you not have? You can't have a middle path, right? But notice the colors. They're the primary colors. These are the colors from which all other colors come, right? They're separate, but they come together in order to form all the different colors. And so we can compartmentalize this. In Korea, there's a very keen sense of a triune thinking. Not necessarily Christian, but the sense that things come in threes. And so if your thinking is that things come in threes, it's not just one or the other, then the question becomes, where do you find the most significant part of the triune? And it's not the line between. It's the point in the center. It's where the three equally significant facets come together as one. It's where they converge together in perfection. We making sense so far? So often when we consider our faith, we forget that what we need in the Trinity is to appreciate the convergence of all three instead of focusing on just one compartment of it. So this morning, because we're in Trinity, threes, we have three separate things we're going to look at. Don't worry. We're going to try to keep it somewhat brief. It's all right. Just, look at your watch if I'm getting too long, and I'll ignore it. So in Luke, right, we see this worship God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Okay? When we take heart and soul, and that can often be pulled into spirit. We talk mind is mind, and strength is body, physicality, right? There's your three. Every one of us has a spirit, every one of us has a mind, every one of us has a body. We got to deal with all three of these things. And if we look at the word worship, this is what I want us to consider, because most of the time we see worship God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we think about this space right here. Right? And it's easy to wrap our heads around what does worship look like with our spirit, because this is a spiritual thing. What's it look like with our mind, because we got to think about it and process stuff. But what's worship look like with your body? Some people would say, you keep your body really still. Some people would say, you lift your hands to the Lord. I was at a service one time, and the music got really rolling, and the pastor leapt out of the choir loft and did forward rolls all the way down the center aisle. It's not. I want to tell the story. Sarah was pregnant. I can't remember if it was with Jake. I think it was with Jake. Sarah was pregnant, and I had to go on behalf of the place I was working for, the Board of Child Care, to speak at this church that was down, I think it was Severna Park, Maryland. And Sarah was tired. She had the stance. She was at the place in pregnancy where you stand like this, okay? And she didn't want to come in, and I don't blame her. So she stayed out in the car and put the seat back. And I mean to tell you, I went into this church, and I thought, oh, we're going to have a service, and I'm going to take 5 minutes at the beginning of it. No. They had like a half an hour of we're going to start with praise time. And then we're going to have a little bit of kind of preaching that we're not going to call preaching time. And it was long. It was long. I felt bad for her. She was not happy when I came out. I don't blame her. But this church, I mean, they had the drums jacking up, they had the cards playing, and they were singing, and it was like a full gospel kind of a thing. And I mean, they were rocking and rolling. And the pastor caught the spirit and twice hops out of the choir loft and runs back into the choir loft. And then they're talking, and it's starting to wind down. You think it's like, all right, we're going to get to that place where I'm actually going to be able to do what I'm here to do. And then, nope, here comes the band. Here comes the pastor. You could say that's worshiping with your body. I don't know that would go over well here. But worship cannot be compartmentalized to the sanctuary. If worship is our offering to God, it's every moment of our lives. Worship is everything we say, everything we do, every choice we make, every relationship we have. In that context, it makes all the sense in the world that we need to consider our body and our acts of worship. Because this whole idea of having a triune being in ourselves, do we need to do our utmost to keep our bodies healthy? Yeah. Now that looks different for all of us, right? Depending on where we're at, what our ailments are, and that kind of thing. The question is, though, are we doing our best to keep the temple healthy, keep our body healthy? Why? So that we can serve with as much vigor as possible. We need to keep the mind sharp, because we have to be able to evaluate and assess the circumstances that we're in. We have to be able to read the context that we happen to be in. We have to understand fact from fiction whenever we hear things or see things. We need to be able to deal with reality, and a lot of that comes through the lens of being able to reason things out with our mind. And we have to be connected deeply to God, because it's that connection to God that is going to help us guide the course of our lives, guide our choices in a way that shines the light of Christ into the world. But if it gets lopsided, things get squirrely real quick. Is it possible for me to only focus on the health of my body? Okay, most of you are saying, but you don't do that. But if all I focus is on the health of the body and the look of my body, what can that lead to? Self-absorption and conceit, right? Every time you walk by a mirror or a window, it's like, I'm looking good. Well, that doesn't really help anything. I mean, it's good to be healthy, don't get me wrong. And I wish I were in much better shape than I am. But if I don't have a mind to be aware of what people are thinking when I'm staring at myself in the mirror, or if I don't have a spirit that helps me guide what I'm doing with my body in a way that honors God, it's very, very lopsided. Same thing with the mind. It's possible to be very, very, very intelligent, very well-read, very understanding and knowledgeable about all kinds of different things. But if I don't have a body that has the energy to do anything with it, and I don't have a spirit that's guiding that information and knowledge in a way that honors God, then I can become very just kind of intellectually arrogant. That's not helpful. And spiritually, if all I do is dive into the Spirit, but I spend no time cultivating my mind and no time with the health of my body, there's a lot of weird stuff that people do in the name of the Spirit. There's a lot of crazy things out there that people attribute to God. And a lot of times the reason it happens is because they haven't thought it through with their reason, the brain that God gave them, or they haven't asked the question of what does this look like in practice? What happens when I try to put action behind it? And it falls apart. So this sense of having this central point, honoring God through the development and health of my body, honoring God through the cultivation of my mind, and honoring God through the connection through the Spirit. They're all critical to living a life that is focused fully in on being faithful to Christ. So that's the individual, right? That's the you, that's the me. But what about the Trinity in the divine? One thing that's really cool about the Trinity of the divine, well, actually the thing that's weird about the Trinity and the divine is really you don't see any place much beyond that verse in Matthew where you see all three of them listed side by side. I mean, we have where Jesus says, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. If you know the Father, you know me, right? But really, you want to do an interesting Google search. Google verses about the Trinity. And then just click on the first one or two things that come up. Because it'll say 25 verses about the Trinity. There are not 25 verses about the Trinity, because the Trinity ain't in the Bible. It's our way of trying to understand this threefold nature of God, right? That's what it is. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? We're trying to get a grip on this. We see this listed in Matthew. And we see the evidence of it from the beginning of the Bible in Genesis. Some of you, we've been studying Genesis, right? And in the beginning, we see that there is the authoritative, creating, orderly God. But what blows across the face of the deep? The Spirit moves across the face of the deep and starts the thing in order. And when Adam and Eve mess up in the garden, does God smite them dead? No. We see this redeeming presence of God that says, even though you have made a mistake, I'm still going to love you. I'm still going to care for you. I'm still going to walk with you even as you exit the garden. And we see all through the Old Testament the long-suffering of God, slow to anger, giving chance after chance for the people to do the right thing. And so we're tempted sometimes to compartmentalize God in the Old Testament as just this creating, wrathful, judgmental God. But from the beginning, we see that God is all three in one. And that's the danger of letting our understanding of the Trinity get lopsided. If we're all God of judgment, and there's no God of redemption, and there's no Holy Spirit, where does that leave us? Really guilty. Trying to follow all kinds of rules that God says, don't worry about those rules anymore. Or like we talked about before, finding loopholes to the rules. I know the rules, but I can find a way around it. Get my own way. If we're all redemption and none of the other two, right? Yay, I'm forgiven! That means I can do whatever I want because I know that Jesus will forgive me. Well, is that what God had in mind? Dietrich Bonhoeffer would call that cheap grace. He would say that it's like you want to accept the forgiveness of God, but then you don't want to let it be transformative. Because that's the whole concept of redemption, is not just to be forgiven, but to let that forgiveness change us from the inside out. And if we don't, that can be a very dangerous weapon we're wielding. In the same way with the Holy Spirit. If we're all Holy Spirit, but there's no sense of the redemptive presence of God or the authoritative, orderly presence of God, we are very much left to our own devices because we don't have a real appreciation of sin, and we don't have a real appreciation that there are expectations that God has of us. So where do we find the fullness of God in the Trinity? It's in the middle. It is a God that is all three, a God that is just and orderly and authoritative and at the same time radically merciful, loving, and gracious, and at the same time sustaining and strengthening and guiding each and every day of our lives. God is the middle of all three. 3 in 1. What's interesting, I just realized as I was doing this, in certain Korean yoga practices, this is a hand posture that they use. And sometimes as they're stretching or whatever, they'll put their hand out and look through it. And that's what it means. 3 coming together in 1. If we want to get a grip on God, we've got to consider God in God's fullness. And that's not always easy to do. Because if I'm angry at someone, I like the wrathful God. I want to see a good smiting. If I'm feeling guilty, I like the redemptive God. I want to forget about the rules and just drink in the fact that I'm forgiven. If I'm confused, I like the Holy Spirit God, because the Holy Spirit God's the one that's going to give me that guidance and going to give me that direction. But lopsided is never completely accurate. We brought up last service, how many have heard of Meatloaf? Not the food, the musician. Okay? He's got a song, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, but it ain't the best. 2 out of 3 still ain't perfect. And we can't let ourselves be swindled into thinking that we only have to think one way about God. So we have the sense of what it means for us to embrace the Trinity of ourselves, what it means to appreciate the Trinity of the divine. These are important because here's the practical. Our job is to bring the reign of God into this world. Our job is to bring the kingdom into creation, right? How often does it happen perfectly? Rarely, if ever. And I'm going to tell you why. And we find it in Jeremiah. Jeremiah knew what God's will was, right? God said to Jeremiah, give this message to the king. And Jeremiah's will was to be in concert with God's will, right? Jeremiah says, I got you, God. I'm with you. I'm going to go and I'm going to tell the king what you told me to tell him. That's 2. That's 2 out of 3. 66%. It may be a D, but it's still passing. But what happens to Jeremiah? He is chucked in a pit, right? His will and God's will were together, but what was missing was the common will. The communal will has also got to be in step with the will of God for the kingdom and the reign of God to come to bear perfectly in the world. And I want to encourage you on this, because how many of you ever had a time where you knew for sure what God wanted and you could see clearly what God was looking for and you were completely in step with it? You did everything that you knew God was calling you to do, and you still feel like you got sand kicked in your face. Well, that's not necessarily, sometimes it may be my mistake when that happens, but it's not always. Because there's that third piece of this communal Trinity. The common will has to be in step with it as well. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And I share that with you for hopefully a sense of encouragement and comfort to say, look, keep forging ahead sometimes, even when you feel like not doing it because it seems like you're spinning your wheels. But also to remind us that whose job is it to spread the gospel of Christ, to try to draw the common will around us into the will of God? It's ours. It's us, right? We have to draw the world in so that they can come to appreciate that personal Trinity in themselves and find a way to connect all three parts of who they are to God and to Christ and to live in the Spirit. And we have to, and that is key to being able to focus in on the Trinity of God and see God in God's fullness and God's perfection and God's will. Those are the two that we can hopefully get in step with, and then we got to rely on the rest. But this Trinity is so critical to our faith and to our life and to everything that we are. We don't always think of life this way. We get distracted very easily. And I just want to encourage you to allow yourself to take time to sink into that moment with God and ask for this kind of clarity. I'm not going to get it right all the time, but the more we get it right, the better we're going to be. And incidentally, I'd rather 2 out of 3 than 1 out of 3. So let's go to God in communion, because as we celebrate communion, we continue to be reminded of this triune nature of God. Why did Jesus come for our redemption? Because we weren't paying attention to the authoritative. We celebrate the sacrifice of the Redeemer.